All right, so today we're talking about this is a case that I did not do last year, just for time constraints. You hear me talk about last year. Last year was kind of a unique little animal, and the way that I characterized it to some other people, it felt like I was in busy season again back in auditing. So, a lot of time, and there's actually a lot of background and preparation that goes into this one, and I was just not really prepared to do it. I repeated it again this year because I think it's interesting. One thing I would like to note is I would have liked it if the authors had done kind of a fictitious data time series, because the most recent time set is actually the year after the one that we looked at. And there's some interesting things about this particular data set and the timing of the year, but I would like to have had something that was a little bit more like kind of arbitrary. Now, that being said, the fact that we have actual dates kind of leads to some interesting conclusions with our analysis, which I do think is fascinating. But yeah, this is a data visualization case that was created by a couple of professors at the University of Tennessee. We actually had a former Truman student that got their doctorate from in accounting in Tennessee, their program. I don't think that he had anything to do with it. This case is actually about 10 years old, but they've updated the data for new stuff. So the original one was something called Super Bowl, and it was spelled Souperbowl. And so the idea being is it's supposed to be a place that specialized in soups. And this one's called Retro Snow, which is kind of the same analysis. Interesting fact about this is that I had the solutions to Super Bowl, and so I felt a little bit cheesy presenting it because I knew exactly what was supposed to be the result of the case. I specifically did not ask for the solutions to this one, so I'm basically guessing alongside you all as how to approach this. I had a little bit of cues because I had the original case, and so I kind of used that as a guideline. But as far as what the correct answers are, the answer is who knows, all right? Or as we all know in accounting, the correct answer for any question that we don't know the answer to, it depends, all right? That being said, there's some interesting identifications. The few times that I've done this case, which this will be the third time that we've done this variation of the case, a lot of my students have picked up things that even I missed, and I spent a lot of time doing some in-grade analysis on this. I actually provided a little bit more detail for this particular class session. I told you all a little bit of the approach that I use, and hopefully that guided a little bit easier. A lot of the previous classes struggled because they knew how to use Tableau, but they weren't really sure what they should do. So that was kind of why I said think about using a scatter plot and so supplement that with a regression analysis. So I think that this will provide us a little bit of guideline. But let's talk a little bit about the company. Let's talk about the approach, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the approach to the answer to the first question before we get into the visualization and the analysis. So this is Retro Snow, which sells shaved ice. Has anybody ever heard of shaved ice before? They said it was like a mixture of a shaved cream. Sorry, not shaved cream, shaved cream or shaved ice. So it's like a mixture of ice cream and snow cone. And I can't say I've ever had that before, but it sounds really good. All right, maybe not today because today it's 40 degrees outside, but sounds like something to be good at the end of the year or in the middle of the year. Yeah, mid of the school year. So this is out of North Carolina, and they had a fiscal year end and normal year end. And they're talking a little bit about some of their products. What was the most popular shaved ice cream flavors included raspberry wedding cake. What raspberry is it supposed to be raspberry comma wedding cake, or is it actually raspberry wedding cake? Has anybody ever had a raspberry wedding cake? I don't know. So what are the things we're going to talk about in auditing today? Well, we talked about whether a raspberry wedding cake was a real thing or not. I think it's supposed to be raspberry comma wedding cake. Oh, maybe it's like a blueberry cookie, sweet tea, and sangria. Sangria actually sounds pretty interesting. I got to imagine it's probably not alcoholic sangria, but anyway. They hit the spot on a warm and sunny day, which is an interesting statement to make. Obviously, it sounds like narrative, but it actually does drive some of the things that we're going to be talking about. So several drive-through locations throughout North Carolina. There are three managers that operate the day-to-day operations, and there's three geographic regions. Now, the regions are really important because not all the regions operate the same way. And this is something that would be something we're going to scrutinize a little bit, both in the analysis and the visualization. We kind of talked a little bit about what was contained within the region, and that each manager knows the local market well and has flexibility to advertise and offer promotions with the overall goal of increasing sales year after year. And the one thing that I highlighted in the case that was really important, because this is going to illustrate what we need to think about with the first question, This company has developed a new incentive plan to boost sales for the calendar year 2020. The manager's set of locations, i.e. the store type, has the highest year-over-year growth or smallest year-over-year loss from 2019 to 2020, will earn a monetary bonus from the company. Now, I know this is not our forensics class, but if we were to frame this as a forensics issue, what would this be categorized with respect to the fraud triangle? This is an incentive or pressure, yes. Okay, so we do need to be aware as auditors that we're going into here something brand new that is going to shape approach. Now, if you're a manager in an area and you get paid a flat rate, you're just like, okay, as long as I'm doing my job reasonably well, I don't care. But then all of a sudden you're hit with the allure of a bonus if your region does the best. Okay, so your store type area does the best out of all the store types. Just like, okay, I'm in competition and I'm going to do everything I can to get that bonus because I don't know. I need 4 cheeseburgers. I don't know. What would be the incentive? I'm a very simple person. I don't need a whole lot. Okay. But yeah, so we do know that that's going to be the incentive there. Now, there's a lot of supporting information that's listed later on. But let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the nature of this particular organization and the time period they're operating in. So we're talking about something that's basically snow cones, and how do we characterize snow cones as a product? Is that something that yeah, that's where I was looking for. Thank you, Jared. So you said it before. I actually haven't provided. So yeah, a seasonal product, very heavily seasonal. So and we can actually say that if it's seasonal, then the warmer months are going to definitely be a lot more. They're going to be a lot better in sales than the colder months. Now, from a perspective of measurement of variables, how is this trend going to look like? What are we going to see? Is we're going to see that it is influenced by temperature? So we say it's seasonal because we expect the summer months to be warmer than the colder months, and that's usually the case, except in Kirksville, where it can be 70 one day and then 10 the next day. So you never know. I expect on a day where it's like 70 degrees, we might just crack out the snowshoes and go over to retro snow and yeah, have ourselves something nice. Yeah, we expect that to be associated with the weather. So that was an important characteristic that was alluded to many times. Then we had to actually develop our analytic. Now, it's important to note that when you're developing your analytic for this is not an analytic for estimation. Now, how does this differ from what we talked about with estimation for analytical procedures? And the answer is we are not trying to determine if we are close enough to revenue to accept it. First of all, does everybody remember our Chapter 5 analytic that we did back in 417? Remember the football game analytic where we tried to estimate revenue? It was a big, long spreadsheet that you had to do multiple iterations on. And what was the result of that analytic? It failed. It failed completely. It failed miserably. And so our conclusion was this is not something that we want to try to estimate. Revenues are not something we want to try to estimate. And so then you may say, well, Dr. Martin, you're giving us a revenue analytic, so we can't really develop an estimate according to what you said. And that's absolutely correct. This is not for the purpose of developing an estimate of revenue. This is trying to determine basically what we think revenue should be on a given day, and to determine what is the difference between those. Now, does that mean that we're going to determine that if there's a misstatement if there's a difference? No, it just means that we have an expectation, we have a deviation from the expectation, and this is going to be a point for investigation. So this is kind of the idea, is that we're trying to develop items that we're going to be using for testing. Now, it alludes to this in the case. It tells a little bit about this, and it says that in the previously they've relied on sample testing. Now, is that a valid approach to rely on random sampling? Yes. Could we supplement that approach and make it a lot stronger if we say, let's identify areas of concern first, specifically test those, and then we can supplement that with a randomized sample after that? Yeah, if we identify the areas that we think are the highest points of concern, that's going to give us much more assurance than just randomized sample testing. And that's what a lot of people do with data analytics and data visualization tools, is they try to say, let's look at the more specific areas of concern first before we do a randomized sample. So that was the goal here, is to say, what are some areas that we want to look at specifically before we move on to the randomized sampling? And again, the goal here is to identify misstatements more effectively. So what was going to be some things that we needed to note? So first of all, the testing was done over a 2-year period. You had the results for 2 years. You had 2019 and 2020. And they said that 2019 was the previous year. We're currently in 2020. What does that mean from the auditing perspective? If you identified a variation in 2019, what does that mean for your testing? Absolutely nothing, okay? Presumably that's already been passed upon. So if we saw something that was an outlier in 2019, it's not relevant. Now, you probably saw some variations in 2019, and you said, that's curious and interesting. And if you investigated them, kudos to you, okay? But that would not be something you'd want to pull for your sample because that was specifically said only pull from 2020. So we ought to identify items for 2020. Now, there was something that occurred in 2020. You all may remember it. This was in your lifetime and occurred in 2020 that I've mentioned once or twice in this course and in other courses that might have influenced sales for the period. What was the big issue that kind of occurred in 2020? I think you all remember it. This is an actual thing that happened. The virus, the COVID virus, yes. All right. So you'll notice that there was some sales issues within a period of time. I believe it was from like March 16th to March 31st. All the stores were closed. Now we're going to talk a little bit about that because that actually we need to determine what is going to be our responsibility for that. There were some other issues as well that you probably want to note. In the late summer of 2020, something else happened that it affected like about 10 stores. And there was only one that was alluded to in the case. But if you looked at the data, you probably found that it was a little bit more relevant. Anybody pick up on that one? You're close. It's a natural disaster. So they kind of talked a little bit about it, and one store had to close, but it was Hurricane Victoria. All right. And so there was a hurricane North Carolina's on the East Coast, and they were influenced by that, so they had to close stores. Again, the case I think only specifically refers to one store that had to close, but there were actually multiple stores that had to close during that time period, which resulted in zero sales. Now, again, this is kind of a similar impact to what we're talking about with COVID. There's some interesting caveats to that, because first of all, that is going to affect our regression results because it's going to say we expected to have $30,000 of sales in the day, and we in fact had $0 of sales because the store was not open, which is going to skew a little bit of our results. Now, as long as we're aware of that, that's fine. All right, as long as we're aware of that, that's fine. That being said, anything else is pretty much an outlier. There are a few ones that are supposed to be obvious outliers, and there's a few that I think that are just kind of that jump out at me that, again, I didn't pick up on my initial analysis, but I'm aware of now. But let's talk a little bit about what your approach should have been. So the first requirement, let's go ahead and go down to the requirements. First requirement was saying, is noted in the case auditing standards specifically require auditors to identify revenue recognition and fraud risk in most audits. Now, let's go ahead and scrutinize that statement. Can we say that revenue recognition has been a source of fraud in prior financial statement audits? Has this ever happened? Has a company ever misstated its revenues in the past? Maybe, okay. If it's not happened, it's likely to happen some point in the future, but I can't think of any off the top of my head except for like a dozen. So we can't say that revenue recognition is fraud risk. Now, based on your understanding of the company, what factors may increase the risk of fraudulent financial reporting and Retrosnow's 2020 revenues? Now, before we answer this question, I want to make sure that we're off on the right foot, because this is going to frame how we identify outliers, or how you should have identified outliers. What would we say with respect to fraud risk would be our primary assertion risk? What would be the biggest assertion that we'd be concerned about with respect to fraud risk and revenue recognition? So you got a choice of like seven different assertions. So you got a 1/7 chance if you just throw a dart at the board. Yes, first try, very good. Existence occurrence. Why? Because we're talking about revenue. We're concerned about a company recognizing fictitious revenues that never actually took place. Now, how does this frame your selection of particular samples? What are we going to be looking for? Are we going to be looking for stores where revenue is below expectation, or stores where revenue is above expectation? Above expectation. Now, what does that mean for all those observations that occurred during the pandemics and the hurricanes? They are not relevant to our items. So we're not going to go and pick and say we're going to say, all right, they had $0 in sales in the day, and I'm going to scrutinize that, because why would a store report $0 in sales for this day? There's something out there, shenanigans. This was not in the hurricane busy season. How would you go to their partners like, yeah, they reported $0 in sales. I think they're committing fraud. Like, they're committing fraud by not reporting any revenues? Yeah, your partner would actually send you back to me to actually go through auditing again. All right, so that's what the result would be. So that's the important thing to note, is we're not as concerned about the downside risk. Now, is it possible, just again, theoretically, is it possible that understating revenues could be a fraud? Yes, we know, because we actually talked about that in forensics a couple of weeks ago. We talked about cookie jar reserves and stuff like that. Is it likely in this scenario that this is going to be the case, that understanding revenues will be a fraud? given that we already know that there's an incentive for them to overreport revenues, and they're already under a lot of pressure because of the store closures from the previous year, this seems like a minimal risk. So our primary risk is the overstatement of revenues. All right. Now, using that as your litmus, what are some of the factors that we would note that are going to increase the risk of fraudulent financial reporting? We already talked about a couple. Store closures due to natural disasters and the pandemic. Okay. What is another big factor that we just talked about? The bonus incentive, the incentive structure. Okay. So competing against other stores and basically the manager saying, I want to be the one. I want to be the very best, like no one ever was. I've heard that somewhere before. Anyway, I throw things out there like that to see if anybody catches it. If anybody laughs and said, yeah, I know what your history is like. So actually, the sad part is the very first time I heard that was probably well before any of you were born. So that's kind of a sad point. Yeah. Anyway, does anybody not know what I'm talking about? Did I just say something and everybody was just kind of like, what is he talking about? I've never heard that phrase before. Okay, good. Okay. There's a few people that are just kind of like, I don't know what it is, but I'm not going to raise my hand. Or there's everybody in the room's like, I know what it is, and I'm not going to raise my hand. Yeah, it's Pokemon, guys. Come on. I was referring to Pokemon. Yeah. Anyway, fraud risk. So we got two factors. Are there any other factors that we can identify that might actually relate to this?
Debt covenant.
The debt covenant. Yeah, actually trying to meet the obligation there. Good observation.
There's only like one bonus to go around.
A limited number of bonuses in this competitive structure, which I'm not a big fan of competitive structure, but again, that does create tension in the case. They didn't ask for my advice on how they framed this case. So I think that would be interesting if they kind of said, I think in a previous version, they said the year-over-year growth. Would that have created a little bit of a contention? Let's assume that instead of saying that they said, you had to compete against other stores or regions, said you just had to improve upon your previous year. Would that have created a lot of tension in this case? Yeah, because how likely is it that you would increase year from your previous year if you're under the pandemic in 2020? Like, I don't think any region or any store would have actually accomplished that goal. So yeah, certainly a few items to note where we're at. All right, so I framed it how I want you to do is I want you to use the daily sales by location. Now, again, you can use 2019 as kind of your litmus of what the distribution should look like, but I thought that you should approach this from two ways. First of all, I wanted you to develop a linear regression expectation for trying to identify what variables would be relevant, and then use a scatter plot visualization to kind of look at the information. So let's go ahead and talk about the regression. And if you used R, kudos to you, because you used a lot more versatility. I can use R, if just barely, but I just went ahead and did mine in Excel, all right? So what was the very first task you had to do before you could even utilize this information for this detail? Because remember, in the Excel spreadsheet, you had two tabs, all right? So what was the very first task you had to do? Probably not hard to figure out because I've got a big column highlighted in yellow that probably gives it away. You had to match the data, guys. You had to join the data together, okay? Because there was tab that had some of this information over here, and then there's tab over here that had the weather. And if you just kind of ignored the weather, then you weren't only looking at part of the data. Didn't we just talk about a correlation between sales and weather? Isn't that an intuitive assumption that weather? So we probably want this weather detail. So how are we going to, and if I'd been really smart, I would have just pulled up the data set. I didn't download the data set, so that's why I don't have it up. But what are we going to do? We have to identify a way to join. Now, if you looked at the number of records in here, and I believe the number of records was so like 30, I don't have my glasses on right now because I got to speaking. 35,000, get out of the way. 35,088 because the first row is a record row. And that's true for both tabs. That tells you that there's not only a primary key, but it's the exact same primary key. What is that primary key? You'll notice that I created one here. I didn't call it primary key, I just called it seed, which I don't know what that means, but primary key. So what does that primary key represent? It's a transaction number, but I created that transaction number. What is that? How did I create it? So one looks like the location number. Okay, so each location has a store number. What is that second variable right there? I'll give you a hint. It's a transformed variable.
The Unix date?
It's a date, transaction date. Yeah, transaction date. So I just basically used a concatenate function, or the shortcut for concatenate function, but I used a concatenate function to put those together. And then I copied and pasted values so that I'd actually come up with this value. And they come up exactly like that. So we can actually join that information. So hopefully you match that. Now, you could have actually done this as a 2-column primary key, which is really, really hard to do. It's possible to do, but it's something that's challenging to do. But that's the very first thing you wanted to do, is to be able to match that data along with that. So once you do that, then you can develop, you can use as I used, a VLOOKUP. As we all know, VLOOKUPs are superior by type of lookup to any other lookup that we know, okay? I know there's been some talk about XLOOKUPs, and if anybody talks about that, I want you to chastise them, okay? Because XLOOKUPs, not necessarily the most appropriate, but yeah. Yeah, I'm just arbitrarily making that statement. There's nobody specifically I'm trying to pick on that, yeah. Mary's over here saying, I teach XLOOKUPs in the class. Okay. You also just teach XLOOKUPs? Okay, you need to get over that. Okay. All right. So yeah, you're doing some whatever lookup. Whatever you look up, you can actually match the variables correctly. And then I just created a multivariate regression. So it's just a linear regression. Now let's take a look at the regression analytics real quick. So first of all, R squared of 26.26. What does that tell you about the fit for these variables? It's low, but it's actually not bad given the limited number of variables we have. I won't say the predicted value is really high, but I also am not going to say it's better than some of the ones that I've done for statistical analysis and research. So 26, given that we only really had 3 variables, we had the variables, we had store type, latitude, longitude, and then weather variables. That's actually pretty impressive. It tells you there's a pretty strong correlation there. Now, if you went a step further and did a correlation matrix, kudos to you, okay? Because you probably found some correlation. But I wanted to talk very quickly about what we identified here. So, interestingly enough, if you look at the variables I included store type, latitude, longitude, and then the weather variables. All of these have extremely high p-values. In fact, precipitation was so high that it basically was 0. Or I should say small p-values, high t-stats, small p-values. So what is the general breakoff for a t statistic? What is the value it needs to be? For going 95% confidence level, we want to have 1.96. All of these are much higher than 1.96. The only one that's even close to that is 2.64. This would be statistically significant at least 95% level. All right. And a lot of these are well beyond that. And the p-values are really, really small, which indicates that. Now, I do want to talk really quickly about one of these variables is deliberately misspecified. I knew this when I went into it, okay? But I do want to talk a little bit about this if you try to do an analytic like this. And if you didn't fall in this trap, kudos for you. If you did the same thing that I did, although, again, I did mine intentionally. Mostly, I did it intentionally because I didn't want to fix the problem. Because I realized the problem afterwards, and I said, yeah, that doesn't work, but I'm too lazy to fix it. So store type. Now, first of all, store type has a massive t statistic, which means that it's statistically significant. All right, so I can include it in my regression. Is there a problem with including it in the regression? How would you classify store type as a variable? Would you say it's a cardinal variable, or ordinary variable, or a categorical variable? So cardinal means that the value is relevant. The value is going to be something that we could use in a mathematical computation. Ordinal means that it's a sequential variable, so like the magnitude of importance. Categorical just means it's an arbitrary assignment. It's kind of a category that's assigned to it. Which one of those would be the most representative of store type? Categorical variable. So is there a problem with including that in the regression? Yes, the value that's assigned to store type doesn't actually have any relevance. If I put it in a regression, I'm saying that the value actually has some relevance. That it's basically saying store type 2 is twice as important as store number 1. Store type 3 is going to be 3 times as important. And I realized this after the regression. I was like, I should take that out, or I should fix the regression. It's like, no, this would be an interesting learning point for that. And that's how I justified this. How I rationalized my fraud. So yeah. So important to note here that that if we include this in here, that's actually got a pretty strong coefficient. And so if we have a category for store 2, then store 2 is going to actually get a coefficient multiplier of 231 times greater in sales for the revenue prediction. Now, there's a real big problem with this, and we're going to see when we get to our tableau, is this assumes that store category 1 is the lowest store category, store category 2 is the middle, and store category 3 is the highest. And that's not true, okay? We're going to find that the distribution does not fall where 1 is lowest, 2 is the middle, and 3 is the highest. Which means that this variable, while it looks like it's got a lot of predictive value, is garbage, okay? Now, what would be the solution for this? I'm not teaching you statistics in this class because I don't know statistics, but just the minimal that I do know, what would be a solution for this problem if I were to fix this problem? So have you all heard the term dummy variables? Did that come up in your classes? So instead of saying that I'm going to assign one variable, I create three variables, and the variable would be 1 or 0 depending on whether it met a certain criteria. And so in this case, it's going to be, I think the indicator variable is the technical term that and they actually call it dummy variables in pretty much vernacular. So store type 1 would actually have a value of 1 if that was the store type there. Then the second variable would be a variable 1 for store type 2. I didn't mean to do that. And then store type 3 would be that one. I realized I was holding up a middle finger. Hopefully it didn't capture my camera. All right. So yeah. So anyway, so that's going to be how we would fix that particular problem. Now, looking at this detail, looking at this data, what would be the variables with the highest predictive value? If I were to actually pick out one variable with a high predictive value. So it looks like precipitation has a really high predictive value here. Got a t-statistic of 48 and a p-value of effectively 0, which means that there's a strong correlation between. And it makes sense because if it's raining outside, are you going to be more or less inclined to go get some shaved cream? Less inclined, just like, okay, it's raining outside. This is dreary weather. I don't feel in the mood for shaved cream if that's the case. So there's a strong negative correlation between that. Another one that we identified, not nearly as strong, but still really high, is going to be temperature max. Now, does that make sense? If the temperature goes up, are you more or less inclined to go get some shaved cream? More inclined, okay? Now, the question is, which variable should we use? And this is a little bit of a misnomer. The reason why is because if you look at precipitation, there are a lot of precipitation variables with a value of 0. So even though it's a stronger correlation, it does not have a strong predictive value because basically anytime there's precipitation of 0, this is always going to be a 0 coefficient. This can be 0 multiplied times whatever this coefficient is. So I do think that the precipitation does play a role, but I would honestly want to use temperature maximum. And we'll see why when we get to the visualization here in just a second. So I went ahead and reran my regression, and I just did a univariate regression. And this one is not nearly strong. It's only like 15% predictive value, but that's still really impressive for a single variable. Which again, if we assume temperature maximum is going to be a single variable, we can kind of see a very strong t-statistic and basically a p-value of 0. Meaning that there's a strong correlation and gives us a good coefficient with our model. So I use that to kind of develop some revenue estimates. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about how you can use these estimates because some of it's arbitrary, but you could have stopped here and say, I'm going to develop my sample expectation from this. And what I want to know is I want to know, based on my multivariate or my univariate analysis, I guess I forgot to put univariate up here because it's my univariate analysis. What is the biggest differences that I identify and then look at those observations. So what do you think is going to happen when I do that? So, well, first of all, let's go ahead and eliminate all of our 2019 observations. Okay, just because we don't care about 2019. And then let's just go ahead and use our multivariate analysis and say anything that differs, we'll say greater than 1,000. Now, do I need to be specific when I say greater than 1,000? Do I also need to see greater than 1,000 like an absolute value? Do I care about anything that's got a lesser, let's say, negative number? What do you think? I have a yes and I have a no. So we have one yes and one no. A lot of people are saying, I'm waiting for you to give us the answer, Dr. Barnes. What do we talk about with respect to underrepresentation? Is how likely are we concerned about stores where they underreport their revenues? We're not as concerned about that. So the positive value is going to be fine. Okay, positive value is going to be fine. So yeah, and then we have our numbers up here that show anything that had a difference of over $1,000. And so we notice that there's quite a few there. And if we sort these, let's go again and sort according to largest differences. All right, so our largest differences appear to occur at Raleigh Airport. Apparently those people at the airport are misreporting their revenues. So we need to go and we need to investigate the revenue. There's a hotbed of fraud going on at the airport, right? All right. So what is the caveat that we need to throw out here with respect to the airport? Are they susceptible to the same patterns as everybody else? No, okay, because they're in a closed space where people are basically kind of in kind of a captive audience, and so their sales are pretty much stagnant. It doesn't matter what the temperature is, they're going to have the same level of sales. Now think about that. Has anybody ever been to the St. Louis International Airport? You know, it's really cold outside and says, I want a snack. Oh, there's a Ted Drew's custard vending machine. I don't know if anybody, they're all over the place in the airport, by the way, which I'd never heard of Ted Drew's until I actually hung out in the airport. Has anybody ever had a frozen custard while it was really, really cold outside waiting on a flight? It happens all the time. Okay. That's why their vending machines are there. So we do actually have a kind of an anecdote that kind of justifies this. So we ignore the Raleigh airport and we can see some observations here. Now, if you picked up some of these observations, for the most part, they're kind of scattered all over the place. The one that I think is really, really worth noting, and we're going to get down here in just a second. Actually, so I want to short this according to location. So let's just, actually, let's sort of according to location. All right. So the ones that I really want to notice is Asheville here. Now, I probably should have been a little bit more thorough in my analysis, but does anybody notice something about Asheville? About they have misstatements that are kind of averaging around $1,500 difference. They're not misstatements, but differences between projection. They're all consistently positive. And what do we know about the dates of those? They're all not just December, but the end of December, the second half of December. Is that suspicious? Yes. Okay. So again, I want you to hold on to that because this is going to parse out when we start looking at the visualization. All right, let's take a look at the visualization now. Now, I did not pull up Tableau, but I did post this on the Tableau a few years ago when we first did this. The reason I don't have it on Tableau right now is because Tableau has been uninstalled on my computer, and it was going to be a chore to try to reinstall this. So I decided to go ahead and use what I have. So here are my three weather variables. Now, here's going to be a note. So first of all, we can see a pretty good correlation between temperature, minutes, and sales. And this is just a basic scatter plot with the revenue as the dependent variable and the temperature being the independent variable, the independent variable. We can kind of see a close correlation there. But if we go one over looking at temperature max of sales, it's just basically temperature minimum sales, but a lot cleaner. And this is the one that I think the analysis should have been performed on. Now, what is this series of stores up here, by the way? This is Raleigh Airport, okay? This is Raleigh Airport, which is consistent with what we expect because look, the sales are flat. Doesn't matter what the temperature is. We look over here, we've got store type 3, store type 1, store type, well, I was trying to find 2, but yeah, store type 2. So the most aggregation of cluster, these are store type 2, store type 1, and store type 3. Now, remember we were talking about store type as a variable in the regression, and I said that was not a suitable variable. The only way that it can be reasonable is if it actually followed into a pattern where store type 1 is the bottom, 2 is the middle, and 3 is the top. We obviously notice that this is 1 right here, and 2 is where the aggregation occurs down here. So this does not work. So think about it this way: if I use 2 as my, if I use this as a continuous variable, basically. Anytime that I have store type of 2, it's going to be all the time a coefficient twice as much as these up here, which is going to skew the results of the regression. But anyway, this is kind of an interesting analysis. Now, what you were looking for here is anything that kind of fell outside of these big patterns of expectation. Now, 2019 is extremely clean. If you just look at 2019, look at that. There are so few skews outside of the distribution. There is something that's kind of interesting, though. Again, we're not testing this, but I encourage you to have inquisitive minds. All right? Encourage you to have inquisitive minds. What's going on up here? Did anybody look at that and say, that's really, really weird? If nobody did, then I'm really disappointed. All right, Tyler did. Okay, you all are saved.
That the Elizabeth City spike
Yes.
in May 17th through 19th, they had a really big spike.
All right. So what do we always do when we find something that looks a little bit weird? Now, this one should be a explanation. We can investigate this, and there's actually a very easy answer. Did anybody want to go further and say what happened in North Carolina during the weekend of May 17th through 19th in Elizabeth City, North Carolina? Oh, we've got all these tools of AI and nobody's utilizing them. Okay. Wow. Oh my goodness. Hold on. Okay, hold on. I gotta get on get out there. Okay. So let's just go to Wikipedia, and I'm just going to arbitrarily type in some words. North Carolina Potato Festival. Annual tradition North Carolina celebrates one of the reasons North Cross blah 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 takes place in mid-May in Elizabeth City, North Carolina. All right. So could that be an explanation? But there's an interesting question. Why did it spike in 2019 and there was nothing in 2020? Well, let's read further. So the festival was canceled in 2020 and 2021 due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but returned in 2022. Interesting. Wow. I'm so glad that I've got an entire room full of auditors that did their research on finding out why there were some outliers. Now, again, you were not responsible for this because this was 2019. But again, if there's something weird like that, that would be something, an opportunity to say, I could make Dr. Barnes proud. How many people made me proud? Tyler made me proud. Everybody else, yeah, eating zeros in the next quiz. I don't care what your results are. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. So yeah, interesting result there. Now, we're not concerned about 2019. We're concerned about 2020. So let's take a look at 2020. Now, again, we're looking for distributions clean like this. We may have some outliers that we can explain, but for the most part, our distribution should be very, very healthy. And if we look at 2020, we notice that there's a lot of outliers. Now, again, what are these outliers down here? These are basically saying sales of zero regardless of what the temperature is. What's going on there? I'll give you a hint. They almost all occurred at the end of March. There were a few outliers in there as well that did not occur in March. I believe they occurred in August. That was the ones for Hurricane Victoria. I believe it's Hurricane Victoria. I tried to look at the research for a class, but I ran out of time. But it was one of the hurricanes that occurred in the middle of 2020. Then we have some numbers that are down here. Now, would we like to understand the reason for such poor performance, why they fell outside of our expectation? Yeah, that would be a good analysis to have. And I would probably argue that this has to do with the pandemic, just kind of results after the pandemic. Just noting that we'll look at May. And so some of these are occurring in late May, which again is recovery from the pandemic when everybody was still trying to avoid going outside. So these are going to be where we think the expectation should have been higher. There's still results, but they're not nearly as high sales because people are saying, I'm staying indoors, I'm shuttering myself up, and not going outside unless I have to, which again was pretty much the trend during that time period. But are we concerned about all this? Even if we don't have explanations for all these, are we really concerned about all these down here? The answer is no, but why not? Because it's unlikely that they're going to unstate the revenue deliberately. What are we concerned about? Concerned about these up here. Now, this is where we're going to identify the spikes. And interestingly enough, what pairs out in our visualization is we have got a lot of observations for end of December in store 1040. Now remember, that was the Asheville store. And we've got like 15 observations or 16 observations depending on the county. I think they were open on Christmas Day, so 16 observations that all exceeded expectations by a significant amount. So what would we be thinking as auditors here? What would be our natural conclusion? Well, it looks like they were going to fall short of the revenue expectations for the year. The manager that region really wanted a bonus. So they increased the sales at one of the stores and basically assumed nobody would notice because it's random sampling. One deviation can be explained away. That's all that's likely to be picked up in the random sampling. They didn't realize that we were going to be doing specific identification methods here that we could identify these outliers. And the outliers are pretty significant. They're about $1,500 on average. And they're easy to see once we look at them right here. Now, here's an interesting question. Does this mean fraud was taking place? No. What does this mean for us as auditors? This is just identification of transactions that we want to research further. I was listening to the video of 2023, and the reason I didn't look at 2024 is because that was one of those rare times that I was sick, and I hadn't watched a previous video. But I was listening to 2023, and my GTRA at the time actually pointed out, said, we actually identified the gingerbread festival that was going on. And I was saying, well, that's kind of weird because the gingerbread festival was end of Thanksgiving, right after Thanksgiving, end of November, beginning of December. And they made an argument saying that, well, because of the pandemic, we think that all the other festivals that were going around at that time, and so there was a much greater population of people who wanted to be part of this. Now, that is a spurious conclusion, all right, because we can't just say that's definitively what happened. But is that a possible explanation for the spike? Yeah, I gave him credit for that. I said, yeah, that's a really good observation. That's something that we would probably want to look into further to figure out if that could be a possible reason behind it. But we as auditors are not trying to identify immediately what the reason for the spike is. We're trying to determine What are going to be the spikes, and can we provide an explanation for it based on evidence? So our next step of this is once we identify these outliers, we would want to investigate them and say, we need to have evidence for understanding that these are legitimate revenues. And if the store manager can say, oh yeah, we had a big inflow during this time period, and I can kind of show you the sales, I can show you the receipts and the transactions, we'd say, all right, well, we're satisfied that the revenues are good. In all likelihood, there's going to be some issue going on here that just seems way too suspicious. But there's certainly a possible explanation for this, and that's what you were trying to identify is what information do we need to get explanations for? Now, I heard some talking about this, and if you didn't identify specifically these items, again, I'm not going to tell you what the correct answers are because honestly, I don't know what the correct answers are. This is basically what I identified based on my analysis and my evaluation. But if you came up with a different outliers, if you came up with some that were kind of in the mix down here based on this, like there might be something down here. What is this? Oh, this is still store 1040. Never mind. Okay. But if you came out some that were coming outside down here that are not necessarily visible, you do the aggregation of observations. Kudos to you for being thorough. My conclusion would be if I write in the memo, it's like saying, okay, I can't limit it to 10 observations. I want to look at all 16 observations for the second half of 1040. Those are the ones that immediately jump out at me. I might throw in a few others that had some outliers, but for the most part, it seems to me this is the only one that has a pattern of misrepresentation over the period. Any other findings that you all came up with that you thought were novel or interesting that we didn't talk about? Any other conclusions that you can come up with saying, this was confusing to me? Can we actually look at it in a little more detail? So one of the nice things about the visualization here is that because if you set a filter on store type and location, you can drill down into this a little bit more in detail. Like if I wanted to look at 1040 and just look at those observations, you can kind of see how that parses out a little bit more heavily. It looks like they had during their pandemic era, this is where they dropped, and this is where they kind of had that spike during the period. That makes it a little bit easier. And this is one of the advantages of visualization tools. I don't think there's nearly as much an uptake as there should be of these tools, utilizing these particularly in audit. But I think this will become more and more prominent because for reporting and storytelling, this is a very valuable tool. I forgot to mention, so we were talking about whether or not precipitation should be a variable of interest. Now, it does have a stronger correlation, but what do we say the problem with precipitation was is that it had that zero value for many observations. So let's go ahead and look at it just from a diagram perspective. And I'm going to look. So here's our correlation if we use the temperature maximum for sales. Here's what we did if we did precipitation. Now, is it easy to observe outliers using this right here? Not cleanly. So even though this has stronger predictive value, I mean, look at this up here. Yeah. There's 3 observations again. Yeah. So yeah, even though it's strong predictive value, as an individual variable, it does not provide as clean a pattern as the temperature max does, which is why I was kind of trying to make sure that you understood the reasoning behind that. All right, so I said we were going to be done early, but unfortunately it's like 5 minutes early. But I would take a few minutes just before you leave and talk about a group and say, if you don't have an idea, start brainstorming some ideas so we can actually sort those out before next week. But I'll see you all on Friday. We're going to quit this.